Hello, everyone. My name is Julia Scott, and I am with Baltimore Racial Justice Action, or BRJA. I want to welcome you to our July 13th of the month. We're so happy to have you here this wonderful Saturday. Hopefully, it is cooler um, wherever you are. I know in Baltimore, it's been very steamy. And so we have been trying to survive this weather. But hopefully it's a nice day where you are and you're able to chill out and we have I think a fun discussion, a very interesting discussion today. Next slide. Just some virtual housekeeping. If you want to keep your video on, it is highly encouraged. But if you don't want to, we also understand. Please make sure you have muted yourself when you're not speaking. There will be opportunities to talk in the conversation later on. So we'll kind of prompt you all with those. And you can also certainly use the chat. So I want to make sure everyone knows that for our time together. Next slide. Just a content recording. I'm in recording advisory. We are recording these. These go up on our YouTube channel. But just given the historic and violent nature of racism in this country and how it's been perpetuated on Black and non-Black folks of color, an examination of history will be challenging and can be challenging. Because of this, we like to provide a content warning at the beginning of our workshops and public offerings. U.S. history of violence against Black and non-Black people of color. These conversations can surface a lot of emotions, a lot of moments of discomfort or pain, and we want to make sure and encourage you to take care of yourself when having these types of conversations. So if that happens for you today, please know that you need to, like, if you need to take a step back, you need to cut off your camera, you need to take a deep breath. Please make sure that you are doing that. And like I said, our 13th of the month events are recorded and they're posted on our social media platforms. So just to give you an advisory beforehand. Next slide. So welcome to mainstream media. Are we being informed, entertained, or indoctrinated? This is our July 13th event, and we're really excited to have a conversation about the media. And I think considering everything that is going on in the national media and local media, in the news, this could actually be, I think, a very timely discussion to think through what we're seeing on our TV screens or hearing on our radio or reading in our newspapers. So I'm very excited to have this conversation with you all, and I hope to have some folks add and join in and share their perspective. So next slide. So just to kind of give you an overview of our actual time together today. So we already did kind of the welcoming and housekeeping. We're going to start with some audience questions and reflections. I'm going to kind of get into like why we're even talking about this topic, and then we're going to actually have a topic discussion, and then we're going to do a closing. So if you are ready to start talking about the news, we're going to go to the next slide and start with our kind of opening question. So when we were talking about this subject and just kind of wanted to get like a foundation of what people's thoughts are around the news. The first question, and Rebecca was very helpful for this. What was the role of news in your house growing up? What did you see? What was your experience? Where did you get your news, or where does your family get their news? And then how do you feel about mainstream media, like the media that you consume on a daily basis? What is your kind of feelings around it currently? Has that shifted any? And what makes a media site or a journalist trustworthy to you? I'm going to give folks a few moments to kind of think through these questions and maybe like jot some notes down for themselves. I certainly have my answers ready, and I certainly have my own thoughts. So I'll give you all a few moments and then we will have a discussion. All right. I'm gonna ask folks to kind of maybe wrap up their final thoughts. And okay, so the first question was, what was the role of news in your house growing up? Um, I know I can certainly do some modeling. The role of the news growing up in my household, my parents got the Baltimore Sun, the local newspaper. My parents read a lot of newspapers, actually, the Baltimore Sun. At that point, we had the city paper. We had, of course, like the Afro. And we, watched the news on a daily basis. Every single day the news was on. I used to think it was extremely boring. And I was very upset that we had to watch it. And my parents also listened to a lot of talk radio. So 88.9, which is Morgan's station, WEA 88.9. And so what I didn't realize until I got older was that that was kind of creating a foundation about like what you're supposed to do daily as an adult. Because to me, being an adult was reading the newspaper. And that became very foundational for me growing up. And I think it's why I'm able to engage with the news and sources the way that I am now. And that is something that I think is very helpful. We kind of just like watching the news on a daily basis now. So we got our news from so many places, not just one, place. Like so not just like WEA or the Baltimore Sun, not just like like CNN, but we got it from all of these places, and then we would have conversations. Like I would watch my parents talk about these things, sometimes debate these things, share their thoughts on like whether they agreed with the article or what the person was saying, add in perspective that usually was not necessarily included in the journalists that we were watching, and so that was something that was very, so like it was very, I think, instrumental in how I view the media. And then I think, like I said, back then I thought it was boring of a child, but I think in today's world, when I think about mainstream media, I've had like a love-hate relationship with it. It's, I think that as I've changed and gone and grown and understood myself and become, I think, a little bit more political or understanding, like I think, of the systems that shape our world, that has impacted how I view the media and what the media is saying to me. I'm questioning, I'm doing my own research, I'm looking for conflicting views, and I like to be challenged and not just told like what I like to hear, but really kind of sit with information and really digest it and kind of combat with it. And I think what makes a media site or a journalist trustworthy to me, I think in the past it was that they had the same ideas as I did, which is I think important, or like the same ideals rather. But that I think that people are actually including people who aren't necessarily like regularly in the conversation. They're adding perspectives that I don't always hear about. They're asking difficult questions. I think that the role, I'm not a journalist, but I think the role of dealing with information and sharing that with, communities or with, the public, it is important, I think, to show that these are sometimes very difficult things to understand. So I think when I see that and when I'm hearing multiple perspectives, that allows me at least to maybe judge it a little bit more, I guess, trustworthy. But that can also shift because that has definitely shifted for me in the last couple of years. So I would love to hear from some other folks about, what their answers are to some of these questions or one of these questions. Um, what is your experience? What are you all thinking about? And the floor is open.
Okay, I will break the ice since and hope that others will step up too. Like you, Julia, in my household, growing up, we had a lot of different news sources. The one thing that I knew very early on was that news was just that, news. It was always slanted toward a whiteness frame and point of view. And I remember very distinctly as were listening to news, my parents and whoever happened to be in our house at the time, adult, sharing how things were from their perspective, giving an alternative to that news, right? And growing up, you knew that what those white newscasters were saying, that was not the story. And I grew up in the 60s and 70s where, there was a lot of, as they would talk about it, riots.
Mm-hmm.
As we understood it, uprisings and unrest because of racial oppression.
Mm-hmm.
We were fighting back. So, understanding the different that people talk from the perspective of where they are positionally placed.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
also understanding that people talk from the perspective of the privilege, belief, and the story that they want to share. And if I can share this quick example, like a real life example, there was an interview between Mike Wallace. Do people know Mike Wallace? Do y'all remember Mike Wallace?
I don't remember, but I know who
Okay,
my
Mike
father is.
Wallace. Yes, and Louis Farrakhan. And Mike Wallace was saying to Louis Farrakhan, he was framing this question and conversation about Nigeria. And he started off by saying that Nigeria was the most corrupt country in the world. You remember this interview?
I've seen clips.
Okay. The most corrupt country in the world. This is how this journalist framed this question and this interview, stating this as a fact with all of the authority and the ethos of his position as a objective newscaster. And it sounds like Fox noise. Well, let me tell you, all of media was Fox noise. Because it did not matter that Walter Cronkite, it didn't matter who the white newscaster was. All of this came from this point of view. Louis Farrakhan said something like, "Oh, come on, Mike Wallace, come on." And so Mike Wallace is saying, well, what? I mean, what am I saying that's wrong? And then had the nerve to say, I visited Nigeria, once, twice, three times. And I know this from my expansive knowledge of Nigeria. And Louis Farrakhan said, as much dirt as the United States has done in its own country and in other countries, how dare you say that Nigeria is the most corrupt country in the world with all of this dirt and blood on America's hands. And then he went on to talk about how the United States had been doing dirt, corruption, blood for 400 years, and that Nigeria was a new democracy, I think at that time, like 20 some years old. And basically he was saying, how dare you characterize them as this with all of the dirt and blood that the United States has. And the United States is, by virtue of that alternative, casting itself as this model to be followed. And it was just such a pristine example of the unconscious bias and the racialized bias that white newscasters were bringing into the mix, regardless of the topic. It did not matter. And because they said it, it was looked at as being the absolute objective truth. And those lessons have really informed my view of media even today. And that view has been reaffirmed by the difference in framing of topics that we see in white-owned, white-driven mainstream media and media of different historically marginalized groups. The
Mhm.
framing and the content is extremely different.
Yeah,
And so that is my background and engagement with media.
absolutely. Yes, thank you. That was a very beautiful example. I've seen that clip and it's come up a few times, I think, in the last year or so. But Farrakhan really does take him to task, and he's actually like extremely offended when he says it, which makes it, I think, even more beautiful. But that,
And Mike Wallace could not believe
yeah,
that Louis Farrakhan did not, that he rejected his frame. He was
yeah.
so angry and trying to hold that anger.
Yeah, and I think that what you said, of course, about the kind of unconscious, and racialized like idea, like this is what the viewpoint is. This is like saying things as fact, and like I've been to these places, so this is what it is. This is what I know, and there's not any questioning of like, well, why is it like this? And like like I think that Farrakhan throughout that interview, and I've seen in similar interviews, talked about also America's hand in a lot of these issues as well, right? It's like that the kind of well, they're so corrupt over there, and it's like, well, like why are they corrupt, and like what is the history of this corruption, all the while acting as if America does not have corruption itself. And so I think, if anything, those types of clips and interviews remind me, especially as I think I started getting older, to examine my own stuff, that everyone has a bias, but more or less like everyone has like their part to play, that the media is a part of, like, I think making sure that America is upstanding, making sure that America is continuing to believe the mythologies of itself. And so that is something most definitely that the news media continues to do. Was there anybody else who wanted to share that maybe they're kind of answer any of these kind of reflection questions around media and their upbringing or their experience? I know we saw Carolyn talk about that being Fox noise, which definitely. Was there anyone else who wanted to share anything?
I I thought I'd share an entirely different experience.
Sure.
I grew up in a small town in Ohio that was completely white. So the role of news in my house growing up, we got the local, I mean, it was a town of 20,000 people. So we got the local paper to learn about local news. And so the role of news was really to learn about what was happening in your community almost more than anything else. We also got the Toledo Blade, that was the nearest city.
Okay.
And I mean, I saw my parents read the paper every day, and I started, but I at some, I don't know, junior high age or something, reading parts of the paper. And we watched, network news. So to us, Walter Cronkite was a god.
Yes.
And I would say that I still watch network news pretty regularly as a way of just knowing like quick headlines of what's going on in the world and what people are talking about. But now I definitely try to supplement it with other forms of media. And then I thought about question 4 a bit. And I mean, the person that comes to mind to me that I really trust is Anderson Cooper.
Hmm.
And the reason is he has gone to the sites. I mean, I think he was kind of famous for his coverage of Hurricane Katrina, and he's gone to Israel, in the past year several times. That what makes me trust him is his seeking out like real people experiencing whatever is happening on the ground.
Okay.
And therefore, when he's speaking from behind his desk, I always feel like his perspective is informed by the empathy that comes from having talk to people on the ground, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. So you trust him and he's trustworthy because of his engagement with like the common person. So you
Yeah.
see him talking to people, you know that it's not just like information being fed, but you actively see him doing this and that
Yeah.
informs. Okay, that makes sense, I think.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
he's going farther than just analyzing, sitting at a desk and analyzing the news, that he's actually
Hmm.
trying to hear voices and incorporate that. I think he incorporates that into how he reports.
Okay. All right. Was there anyone else? Rebecca?
Yeah. So I grew up the kid of white liberal parents, and so we listened to National Public Radio as white liberal families are wont to do. And really I think not only saw that as a reliable source of news, but maybe saw it as a more superior form of news
Mm.
than say the newspaper or network media. So sort of this idea that because it was National Public Radio, because it was sort of a longer form news site, that meant that it was sort of, better or more reliable or more in depth or whatever. And what I think has shifted for me and sort of and goes into question 4 about making it trustworthy is that I don't know that there's any media site or journalist that is 100% trustworthy for me.
Mm.
But what I will do is take the reporting and sort of throw it up against my analysis. And my understanding of how race operates in the United States, of how oppression operates in the United States, of the history of those things, and think about what are the questions that the reporters are asking, what are the things that they're pulling out, are they giving context to what's happening, or are they just sort of saying, X happened. And so that and I find that there are some media sites or journalists where I'll be like, okay, this is holding up.
Hmm.
And then there'll be some that is like, well, this is not holding up at all. And then there's a lot sort of like in the middle, but never really saying, okay, I can take this and just sort of go with this. I always need to be sort of interrogating and saying, does this mesh with what I know about how racism operates in the United States? What is being said, what
Absolutely.
is being hidden? Yeah.
Yes, thank you. And we're going to talk a little bit more about like, when you're using like throwing things up against your analysis, like what does it actually mean? Um, and what can that look like? I think is very important as we're, talking more about being anti-racist and anti-oppressive. I'm going to ask us to the next slide. Please certainly feel free, like I said, to use the chat as a way of discussing this as well and adding points. We love to hear those things. So why this topic? The news impacts how we understand what is happening in our country, in the world, and our place in it. And also, I think about ourselves. Who do we see ourselves as? As a Black person, I have a very distinct, idea about my place in America. But what does that mean for me as a quote unquote American? That is shaped by the news and what we're told about ourselves, not just our histories, but our daily kind of occurrences. Our organization has actually discussed events like these before, focusing on the news and the media. You can actually catch those on our YouTube channel. We've had a few of underreported current events talking about the importance of the stories that usually get left behind out of local and national news because they're usually impacting folks who are folks of color, folks who are marginalized, and what does that mean for our understanding about like, what's happening in the world. And so it is important to remember, and this goes for even the newscasters that we love, like Anderson Cooper or folks on MSNBC. And if there's folks who love Fox News, you do you. But that most of the news that we consume protects the status quo. Meaning it supports and protects white supremacy culture and the history and the mythologies that come along with it, and that it is about sustaining these myths, right, and kind of keeping you in the status quo arena, as opposed to sometimes questioning what is actually happening, questioning folks, who are in power, questioning our politicians and why we do the things that we do. And so our anti-racist, anti-oppressive, or ARAO, if you've heard me say, lens should challenge us to question how and why the media operates the way that it does. Why is it when certain conflicts happen, if you are bombing someone, if someone over here is bombing someone, it's a terrorist threat, but if America does it, it's not called a terrorist attack? Why is it, that when we think about George Floyd, for example, the police's, first conversation about what happened to George Floyd was taken as fact, as opposed to maybe investigating that something else could happen. So we should be questioning constantly, like, where are people getting their information? And why are the stories that are popular, that are headlines, why are they even headlines when there might be other parts of the story that aren't there? And so it should also allow us to explore how we can do better. This is a constant struggle. This is a constant and growth that you have to go through. I'm constantly being changed and questioning, and it is uncomfortable, but it is extremely important if we are talking about being more anti-racist and more anti-oppressive. So let's go to our next slide, actually. So just to kind of give some quick background to make sure I let folks know, if you didn't know, of course, like the role of the fourth estate, which is something that the media is usually called, that term is often attributed to Edmund Burke, and he was talking about in the states how there was a meeting, and of course the government, and that the media was also there, and how important they were, and sometimes actually more important than the other estates. And so in the United States, the fourth estate is, of course, considered to be the media journalists, along with our legislative, executive, and judicial branch. And so it's been said, I'm sure, especially if you're going to continue to hear it all this year with our election, with it being an election year, that in order for democracy to work, there must be an informed electorate. Part of us getting in the news is so we can make actual decisions that impact us on a daily basis. And so the fourth estate, the media's role is to actually serve as a watchdog of the government and our politicians and those in power. And so it has the power to expose corruption and provide, I think, a more clearer view of what our institutions and political systems are doing. However, our media landscape has changed over the years. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily changed and gotten better or gotten worse, but it's certainly done something. And so that forces us, I think, to ask more questions, more informed questions, deeper, and deepen our analysis when asking those questions. Next slide. And so, as I think some folks have already kind of stated, go back, that the news has actually never been neutral, right? So the news is like, it upholds the status quo. There are blatant examples of racism, sexism, classism, even who has been allowed to, to tell you and be the person in front of the news is up for, I think, a lot of speculation and discussion. And so America has become more polarized than ever, and the traditional social media channels have only exacerbated this issue. So our news is actually continuing to create this divide. And so elites also have a huge hand in our news and they influence the news that we receive and the way that it is reported. So a really good example, a lot of our local papers and our online publications and a lot of our influential newspapers like the Washington Post, the New York Times, are partly or completely owned by billionaires. So I believe, who is it? Dude from Amazon, he owns like the Washington Post. What does that mean for how the news is told? What stories are chosen to be, shared? What journalists are hired and what they're allowed to say or not say? Another good example is in Baltimore. David D. Smith, who was the former CEO of Sinclair Broadcast Group, which is a pretty conservative broadcasting group in America, they bought the Baltimore Sun earlier this year. What does that mean for our city? What does that mean for a predominantly Black city and the stories that are told and how those stories are told? And that's important to think about when we're consuming the news, not just the actual information, but who owns the paper and what does that mean for the stories that are allowed to be shared. Next slide. And I would be remiss if we did not mention the fact that social media has definitely changed the way that we engage with information, and how it's consumed and shared. And of course, again, I think it allows a lot more echo chambers. So you're only looking at what you want to look at. Certain, people, if your family shares something, you're going to read that. And that has created, of course, a lot more impact on our public discourse. And so while it does expose people to differing news outlets and sometimes differing views, just good, but it does tend to expose them to a more narrow range of news topics and information versus what they might get on the traditional news website. So that is something I think also where like the social media is like a gift and a curse of our current media landscape. Next slide. And so for our main points today, we're going to be talking about news as entertainment, news as indoctrination, and news as information. I really hope that we get some folks to talk really about their experiences in all of these. We have some audience questions after we kind of go through some of these kind of like background histories and facts. So let's get started. So we're going to start with news entertainment. And I want to start with this quote by Todd Gitlin, who was a professor of sociology and journalism at Columbia. He said, "Everybody wants to be entertained by the news. Most people want no problem news, goes down easy news, Yahoo headlines, news that evokes feelings, even if those feelings are feelings of fear." I think that this news as entertainment is very important to talk about because one of the biggest things that I've seen the last few weeks was with the Trump and Biden debate and how the news, it was like watching analysts talk about the Super Bowl. It was very strange, but that the news has to be entertaining in order for people to engage with it. Next slide. And I think that it's important for us to understand what that does. And so what people are, there have been actual studies about this, so news, entertainment, or both. I'm a media scholar, Stephanie Edgerly and Emily Vargas, they explored how audiences navigate today's media landscape by conducting some studies around whether something is entertainment or something is actual news. And it really depended on the host. And so the study that they came to the conclusion that it raises questions as to what do people consider something, when do people consider something news, and how does that influence how they process the information? So if they see it as entertainment, how do they process it? If they see it as news, how do they process it? And that's, I think, really important for our own kind of analysis. When you're getting information, depending on who it is, how are you processing that information? Next slide. And we currently live in a world where we have a lot of kind of entertainment news, like The Daily Show, Last Week Tonight, Colbert Report is the old one, Bill Maher, we had like Samantha Bee. Those are, these very popular, funny, usually 30 minutes or to an hour, kind of like news formatted comedians that are talking about today's issues, that are kind of giving us an inside look on some of these like really headline like topics. And I think it does have an impact on how people engage with the information. Like, I know there was a very big thing with The Daily Show where this week after Biden's first, debate or whatever that was, that he, Jon Stewart was on The Daily Show and he gave his thoughts, and it was like it's taught as news. People shared it all over. It became a very, it became very important to a lot of people. But what does that mean? I think for people's actual engagement with information, is it actually news? Next slide. So I want to ask the audience a question. What are the benefits of the news being entertaining and what are the drawbacks? What are some of the things that, come up for you? Do you watch shows like The Daily Show or Bill Maher? How are you engaging when you're thinking about entertainment or news as entertainment? Oh, you know what? While you're thinking about that, I do want to answer the question that Elizabeth put in the chat. How are we defining mainstream media? Notice that neither public nor radio nor public television. Yeah, so I think that mainstream media can actually encompass a lot of all of those things. These are just some of the examples that we use, but I definitely think that you can include, public radio or public television in those in that kind of arena. I think that's a very good question. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Julia, I
Yes.
also was intrigued by the question, and I'm so glad it came up, because it reminded me that a lot of times what we look at is the vehicle
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to the ideology behind the vehicle. Who is it that is making decisions?
Yes.
Right. And so even when we're talking about like a Maryland Public Television or a WYPR or whatever, we're still talking about people who may be white liberal, but
Yes.
they still come from a white
Mm-hmm.
liberal mindset, ideology, and understanding. So we're talking about degrees of understanding of other histories, other experiences in the
Yes.
United States of America. The history in total, people still may be indoctrinated in the same way that we all are, which gets back to if someone else is bombing another country, it's terrorism. If America is doing it, there is an assumed good reason behind it.
Mm-hmm.
So it is in the same category. It may be a different degree,
Yes.
but still the people who are behind it, the people who are making the content decisions, the people who have to answer to people, right? They're still answering to people who are coming from a very specific understanding and buy-in to the United States
Absolutely.
that may mirror the same as any corporate mainstream media, except
Absolutely.
in degree. So Maryland, public television or radio, corporate television or radio, CNN, whatever, Fox News, different degrees, but shared understanding in terms of how we have been indoctrinated in what America is and how America has operated in American history. And that impacts our framing.
Yes, I think I think it's important to remember, I think as Adar just said, I think even Rebecca kind of alluded to it when talking about like, NPR and whatnot, that these things are on a spectrum, right? It's like, but the reality is that you still have to question whether it's public radio or public television, whether it is someone that you trust or not, with the news, or even if you see them interviewing people, what people are they interviewing? Like what are, and especially if you're going to another country, I'm not sure of all of the politics that are happening necessarily in Israel or in Nigeria, but if, somebody is speaking to them, like who are the other people they possibly could be speaking to? If it's not Anderson Cooper and maybe say a Joy Reid, would Joy Reid speak to anyone differently? So I think that those are questions when we're kind of, like I said, using our analysis to think a little bit more deeply about these things. But that was a very good question, and I think something to add to as we're kind of thinking about this topic. Back to entertainment. I wanted to know what people think the benefits of the news being entertaining are, and what are the drawbacks. Did anyone want to share their thoughts?
So the benefits are ratings.
Oh, absolutely. I'm going to remove the spotlight, but yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, the ratings of it, I mean, and we've seen you started out saying, how media or news has changed, news coverage has changed.
Mm-hmm.
see it in terms of how media covers Trump.
Yeah.
And the way, I mean, and I think media was even calling itself out in terms of how they cover Trump, and knowing that Trump is a ratings grabber. What are the drawbacks? Some of the drawbacks are just information, and whether we get information, or whether, whether the main focus is on information, or whether the main focus is on that rating. And I'm also reading Carolyn's comment.
Yes,
in
that right
chat.
now one drawback is that the news moves so fast. Everyone is competing to be the first to get the story out, which
Mhm.
leads to misinformation and subsequent disinformation. Absolutely. I think that, look, as I said when I was a kid, the news was boring. Mainly because I was not necessarily involved in what they were talking about. I mean, I was, but I was not like, oh, what's going on with, the government? The government to me was something that adults dealt with. When you're a child, you do child things, But as you get older and you start to understand, it's like, I understand wanting to be entertaining. You do want people to feel they can watch you and they're not bored to tears, or, whatever the case may be. But I do think that a lot of the way that I watch like sports, entertainment news, or other kind of like, entertainment news, I have seen a very similar kind of thing in like mainstream media, the way that it's done, the way that it's like sold to us. I do think like with things like The Daily Show or a Bill Maher, or, or Samantha Bee, that it can be, I think, a great invitation for younger people as they're learning. I think that, sometimes, politics art can be very funny. And I think that these things are actually, they can do a very good job of getting to the meat of certain issues, of really, I've seen some really great reporting from John Oliver. I think that he actually does a very good job of questioning, and that's great. I also, at one point, unfortunately, was a fan of Bill Maher, and I mean, I don't know what's going on there now, but I think that, it can be validating, right? But I think that that's the other part, that the validation can also be a danger, because you're not questioning, you're not thinking outside of your scope. If Bill Maher, or if your person is, a Stephen Colbert, if they are confirming what you believe to be true, then you may not think outside of what those people have said. You don't go in search of other information. And I think that part of the reason someone like a Bill Maher, for me, has shifted. I was watching him recently, and I was like, what is this? It's because I have also shifted. Like, I've grown in my own kind of like thought process. And when I realized that, oh, he's not asking these other questions, he's not having these other thoughts, he's not bringing on these other guests that could provide a different perspective, that is something that I think is important, and that can be definitely a drawback. Carolyn also said another problem is pundits wanting to be seen as wise and able to predict the future and be the go-to, and it results in stories spinning out of control at the drive to push. But yes, we're going to use some Biden stuff in a bit, but absolutely, I think that if one person says it, then it becomes the news cycle for like a week, when there are so many other things that we should be discussing. And not just Biden, but like we also have another, nominee with Trump, and like his kind of story ends up getting lost in the fold. And he should definitely be discussed. So absolutely. I want to think, like, as we're kind of thinking more about entertainment, what does that mean, I think, for helping folks become indoctrinated? What does that do for indoctrination, which is our next topic? I'm going to go to our next slide. So Malcolm X once said, and I always keep it in my brain, if you're not careful, the newspapers will have you hating the people who are being oppressed and loving the people who are doing the oppressing. And when I think about this quote, when I first read it, you know what it means. But I think that definitely, over the last few years, you have definitely seen it, play out right before our eyes. Indoctrination, the newspapers, our media has a buy-in about what America is, the myths that America has told itself. And that means that the information you're receiving is going to be from that viewpoint, from that ideology. And it's very important, I think, to remember that when you are getting information, questioning why that information is being given to you and by whom. We can move to the next slide. So let's talk about news as indoctrination. A little bit of history, and some of my fellow BRJA folks definitely helped with this, with the Hutchins Commission, which was also known as the Commission of Freedom of the Press. This was formed during World War II when the publisher of Life and Time magazine, Henry Luce, asked the University of Chicago president, Robert Hutchins, to inquire about the proper functions of media in a modern democracy. So this kind of conversation about what the media's role in our democracy has constantly been a conversation. And so after 4 years of kind of, doing their research and asking questions, the commission published this report, A Free and Responsible Press in 1947. And it found that the press plays an important role in the development and stability of modern society. And as such, it is imperative that a commitment of social responsibility be imposed on mass media. So I want us to think about this, that the important role that media plays an important role in the development and stability of modern society, that it helps us, it keeps us stable, right? And that stability word is doing a lot of work there. And I want us to think about what that actually means, and how that plays out when we're thinking about this from an ARAO framework. Stable for whom? Stable for everybody? Stable for, certain people? Who is it keeping it stable for? Because I know that not everybody is stable in this country. And using the social responsibility theory, the press has a moral obligation to consider their overall needs of society when making journalistic decisions in order to produce the greatest good. Once again, producing the greatest good for whom? Who is included in this, this idea of society when we're talking about the news and the media? So these things like these are very interesting. I think that it is important that the news is doing this. The media has social responsibility, but we should also be questioning for whom. What is the status quo? Are they the ones who are only going to be stable? Is this for everyone? And if it is for everyone, that means that there has to be folks from different views, from different experiences, who are questioning and pushing in our news media. Next slide. And we also have the Fairness Doctrine, which was from 1949 to 1987. And that was formulated by the Federal Communications Council, the FCC. And this was attempted to ensure that broadcast stations' coverage of controversial issues was balanced and fair. And so that the viewers also were exposed to a diversity of viewpoints. And it had two basic elements. It required that broadcasters devote some airtime to discussing controversial matters of the public interest, and that they had to also air contrasting views regarding those matters. So at one point, that was not necessarily something that folks had to do. And a lot of journalists at the time really pushed back because they saw it as an infringement on their First Amendment rights. And so in 1985, the FCC said the doctrine had a chilling effect on the freedom of speech. There were certain things that were they kept within the doctrine, but it was formally repealed in 1987. And it has been said that with its demise, it has been a contributing factor to the rising levels of polarity in our party systems in the country. So I want us to, history is there for a reason. I want us to really, when we're thinking about media and what's happening currently in our news media, what led to us, having this, we have Fox News, which we know was like the conservative news channel. What led to this kind of polarization of information, and what does that do, I think, for the public as we're having conversations and engaging in information. Next slide. And so just a little bit more about that kind of indoctrination, the US polarization. So studies have found that the US is polarizing faster than other democracies, which is very interesting. And as you kind of see on this kind of right picture slide, where you see the different kind of like news and where they fall on that spectrum we were kind of discussing earlier, this kind of media bias chart. So you have the left, on the left side, and the right, on the right. And so you see that, for example, like BuzzFeed News, or the Daily Beast or HuffPost, those things are considered left. And you have like, ABC, which are like left leaning, and you have these kind of centrists, which are like NPR, USA Today, the Wall Street Journal. And then on the right, you have like Fox News, the Federalist, National Review. I will say, I think that even, like I said, with more billionaires and more money being put into our media, some of these have even shifted, right? So like these aren't necessarily even, I think, the same anymore, but this is always, I think, in flux. I see Carolyn put, getting rid of the fairness doctrine has led to the both sidism in reporting, i.e. one climate scientist interviewed with one climate denier leads people to believe they are equal points of view, and they are not. The BBC was the first to say they wouldn't do that anymore. Absolutely, I actually do agree with that. I do think that, and we're going to talk a little bit about the illusion of objectivity in the news a little bit later, but that is definitely something I think that, we see a lot, and that adds to a lot of our issues in reporting the news, I think, and even being able to discuss pertinent topics today. Next slide. So I think it's important to remember that the media intended to indoctrinate, to make sure that you are, thinking one thing. It does not care about addressing the points that the audience thinks is valid. It's not about like, oh, well, I think about it. Indoctrination, the media, it does not care about that. It focuses more on directing the audience on what versus convincing them of why to think it. So they're telling you what to believe and what to think versus why you should think this way, and giving you kind of background. And so I remember in the last few years, especially with the rise of Donald Trump in our, political system, there have been so many studies and discussions and people talking about their family members who watch Fox News all day, every day, and how they have become indoctrinated in this kind of far right, way of thinking. I have family members that are very big fans of MSNBC. I watch MSNBC daily, but I get my news from other places. But even that is happening, where it's like, well, they said this, like, and that becomes the norm. And so we already know that because the news in our country built on white supremacy continues to tell itself the same stories, but now you're seeing people kind of putting themselves on certain sides because of the news that they're watching. The indoctrination that happens is that America is this is what it's supposed to be, and we're not going to question that, and this is what you should vote for, this is what you should believe. And I think that that is something when we're talking about indoctrination. It doesn't invite us to question. It doesn't invite us to push back. And that the journalists, and I also want to just say this very quickly, not everybody who is on the news are actual journalists. Some of these people do not have actual journalism backgrounds. Some of them don't have a journalistic integrity. So even with that, like, I think it's important to know and understand that just because someone's talking to you in front of a camera, they're not a journalist. That they are making sure that they are keeping with the status quo, whether it be with Fox or MSNBC or WYPR. They all come from an ideology, and they're all making sure that you are believing that, and this is what you should be thinking. That is something that I think indoctrination, that's what happens with indoctrination. Were there any other thoughts or, examples that people wanted to share, maybe what you've seen? Elizabeth, hello.
Yeah, I want to make a couple of comments. While I agree about public radio and public television being largely sort of white liberal based, WEAA is somewhat different, and it's not only white voices, so that is important to keep in mind. I also think about Democracy Now! On public television, which used to be on the radio and probably available streaming.
Yes.
I don't use that. I thought of the Malcolm X quote, and really, democracy now makes me love the oppressed and hate the oppressor. It's its own indoctrination to some extent, although it does work on why as well as what to think. Also, I have a friend who is very, very left-wing and has the stamina to be responding to some of the terrible things that she sees on X/Twitter, and has made a comment also about hoping that, well, wondering how it would be easier for some people to listen to, say, public radio, if there weren't so many speakers with foreign accents. And I was appalled to hear that, because I have always found it very encouraging to get people's with, you know, names that sound quote unquote foreign or non-WASP. And maybe if you see them, that they have, their faces are people, those are people of color. But her point of view is that if people who are spending all their time on Fox News would be persuaded to listen to something else, they might be turned off by these different voices. And I just, that's a terrible dilemma in my mind.
If I can piggyback on that, I'm so glad that you shared that, because for me, it really illustrates how media is a tool of something much larger. And that is the social contract that undergirds everything, right? And it's not just about whether people who are journalists, who aren't, whether it's left-wing media or right-wing media. It really is about what is America, and what is seen as the center and the core of America. And when we are looking back at the 1800s, the 1900s, all the way up to the 1970s and even beyond, when we look at what that central question of what is America is, right? It was that America was this right wing, using a current term, white supremacist ideologist country. So we have a media that really was right in that frame, and its news was in that frame. So you had people who were, you know, putting ads in the paper about quote unquote runaway slaves, and that was completely normal. And within journalistic standards, right, you had people who were talking about riots happening in inner cities. Whereas if they were talking about something happening in other countries that were supporting US interests, what they would be talking about were rebellions and freedom fighters. So the press has always centered and framed its stories and content depending on the larger social contract that the United States of America is and was at the time. We've seen the changes because we've seen what is acceptable change in the United States of America. Now, there is a segment of America, and it's not just right wing, it's central, people who would consider themselves central too, who are saying, no, this is too far. And so what we see in media is a response to that, whether we classify it as indoctrination or as entertainment or as news. Media is responding to what society at large is putting out there as part of the social contract. And this is why we hear that some things are described as divisive, as radical, because those terms really reflect where society, where the central part of society is. And again, media is a reflection of that. So they're doing all of these things at the same time. What media is great at is letting us know where the center of this country is and what the prevailing social contract of the country is, because that is how America frames its content and its stories. It is how it uses its buzzwords like divisive or defiant or whatever the heck it is. It is coming from that deeper thing. It's not creating it. It is responding to it.
Absolutely. And I think this is, even in some of my own research and some of the conversations that we're having today, is that the media is also, I think, important to recognize, like, the weaponization of language, right? Like how language is used in the news to continue to shape our viewpoints. Like I said, I use the example of, a terrorist attack, versus like, oh, we're trying to, do something else if we're bombing someone, right? Like, usually it's not America has become a terrorist in this other place. It's like that's not what is told to us. We're told something else. Now, if you go to those countries, like, you go to those places and you ask them what it is, it used to, that's not what they're gonna say. They're gonna say that America, has terrorized them. I remember there was it used to be a comic, and I mean it floats around, I think, every year or so often around elections, where it was, a comic strip of folks who were, Arab, and it was around the time that I think either Barack or Hillary Clinton was like running for office, and they were talking about the fact that, what the US president is actually really about when it comes to foreign policy, that they're bombing other countries, like they are okaying, the decimation of places. And it was, it's kind of a joke, and it's like the person is saying like, oh, there's another bomb coming. It's like, oh, it feels very different because, like, it's like a person of color, or it's like, oh, it's a woman who is the president who's done it. And so I think that it's important, as we're kind of reading and engaging with information, that we're recognizing how language is also a huge part of the stability of white supremacy, of keeping with the status quo, and that there is an intentional choice in the words that journalists or pundits or newspapers use when talking about issues both foreign and domestic. We talk about, when the Baltimore uprising happened, folks who are very close to that issue, they knew that it was an uprising. They felt it. It had been felt for days. But if you went on the news, it was like, it was a riot.
Right.
A riot broke out in Baltimore. A riot broke out, in St. Louis. Like all of these things become riots. And riots, when you hear the word riot, a very particular feeling pops up in your head. A very particular view, a picture pops up in your head. And so just as much as the information, the language is also doing a lot of work to convey, what we think is actually happening. And so that's a part of the indoctrination and how the news media uses that. So I want us to make sure we're paying attention to that.
That's the meta communication that we
Yes.
never talk about, right? It is, and it is always functioning in stories. And again, in the way that things are framed, because you're right, those words evoke a picture and an emotion that sends people, that tells people how they should be feeling. So even though it is a way of sharing information, it is even more than that by the use of the terms telling you what you should be feeling about a particular event about which they are sharing.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Yeah, language is very powerful. And so a lot of the time we don't always think about it, because once again, you're taught in school what things mean. But when you really think about like how, white supremacy works and how that even works in our education system, language is a huge part of how we continue the status quo and what's happening in our country. So I think it's very important to pay attention. And I've been paying, especially I think when we talk about foreign policy, I always hear it. I'm like, well, they bombed this, but they're terrorists. Like, what is going on? That is something. And once you start to see it, you hear it everywhere. So just really being mindful of those things. Next slide. So just to kind of, I think, wrap up this part of the topic, and this is the important thing, when do you question the news and when do you take it as fact? And what are the warning signs that something might be indoctrination? I mentioned, of course, like the what versus the why. For me, a lot of it is for indoctrination, especially when I don't hear any kind of opposing views or when it's just like, well, this is what it is, and like there's nothing else, that starts to kind of be a warning sign for me. Obviously, I think whoever is really doing the talking usually is a huge indicator. But I start to question the news, and when do I take it as fact? I very rarely just take things as fact nowadays. I think that's the final answer for me. I don't necessarily take it as fact. I think that facts mean different things for different people. And that is something that I, in my own kind of ARAO journey has been hard to let go of, but it is a reality. I have to not take everything as fact. I can take pieces of information, but I have to do my own research. I have to talk with other people. I want to look at the history. How did we get here? All of that informs, I think, my view, and it's important to be able to think about that. Is there like maybe another person who wanted to share before we start to get to news as news? Develop a habit of lateral reading as I go through the news. This is Carolyn, and also have a need to check sometimes even benign stories. Absolutely. It is so, I think the amount of information that we get in a day is actually not healthy or normal for our brains. And so the fact that we even have a 24-hour news cycle, to me, is actually a lot. And I think that if anything, that makes it easier for the indoctrination discussion, for the indoctrination to happen, is because there's not a break. You can constantly getting information. You're constantly bombarded with information. If you're on social media, something like Twitter, because I refuse to call it by its other name, you'll see media ads like, are you with Donald Trump? Have you read this article? This, that, yeah. It's like, it is madness. And so constantly checking. It's very easy, I think, to share something and not spare a second thought, to believe something and not spare a second thought. But the reality is, I think it is having to question. It is having to think a little bit more deeply about the information that we receive and why we're receiving it. Let's go to our kind of last topic, which is news as information. So around these parts, Ida B. Wells Barnett is huge. She a fan club around here, but she once said the people must know before they can act, and there is no educator to compare with the press. And so when we were kind of talking about this event, and yesterday we were kind of doing some final planning, I really wanted to make sure that we lifted up Ida B. Wells Barnett, mainly because of her bravery and her activism and her journalistic work. Where she was going around and actually getting alternate viewpoints and sharing the story of lynchings that were happening. For one, how dangerous it actually is. I think that real journalism is very dangerous when you are questioning the status quo, when you are going against what is the story that everybody else is saying. And so when these stories of lynching, I think Adar had just kind of mentioned, like, oh, well, they were putting slave catchers things on newspapers, or like, they were putting lynching, information in the newspapers. And so when lynchings would happen, and Ida B. Wells would be like, well, wait a minute, they're saying this guy, sexually assaulted this white woman, this black man in front of this white woman. Like, is it possible that maybe they were in a relationship, that white women are attracted to, like they were actually having a consensual, like, and she got a lot of heat for that. Like that was like, you did not say that. That caused problems. And so I think that it shows that what the truth is, it takes a lot of work to get to, but you got to ask the question. And when you have people who are asking the questions, like an Ida B. Wells, who are trying to uncover, the corruption and the deception in the news that we receive, and force us out of our bubbles, our comfortable ideas, that is dangerous. And I think that it's important to talk about that. Go ahead, Adar.
Julia, I'm sorry. And I also just want to mention with the example that you shared, is that during that time, the press reported about lynchings, normalizing it.
Yes.
Lynchings were held as picnic events.
Yes.
The press normalized that. They did not report about it as a crime. And so the point that I was making about the press is a reflection of what is allowed and where America is in greater society. That's a great example of that, because the press could have reported about it as a crime.
Absolutely.
It did not. It reported what they knew would be acceptable to society as large. And yes, absolutely, Carolyn, just as the press has normalized and continues to normalize Trump, we're at day, 15, 16, 17, 18, about the press reporting on Biden's debate performance, even after all of the other events that he has held, but yet there is no comparable reporting about all of the things that Trump has said that signals his vision of his takeover of the country. There's been no comparable reporting of Project 2025, which lays out a plan of white supremacist takeover of the country. There's been no comparable anything. The press, the mainstream press, is a reflection of where the country is at the time and what the country, white America, because that is what we're talking about in great part, will accept at this time.
Right. And I mean, I think it's like, even with that debate, for example, we can say what we want about Biden's performance. And I think that, there are valid questions around his capability to be president. I think that's a fair conversation. However, Trump stood up there and lied the entire time. And I have not really heard about not really substantially any of the lies that he's told. I remember when he first got elected, and I forgot, was it Sean Spicer was his person that he had kind of sent out. But after his inauguration, and he was on Fox News, and I watched the interview, they were like, "Oh, well, he had the biggest inauguration of any president in the history of this country." He had all of these people there, and we literally saw the pictures. They were putting the pictures up and comparing it to Obama's inauguration, and it was like, well, it's clearly that he has less. It's like, no, that's not true. Him and all the people in his administration, they lied to our face every single day, and the news was treating it like, oh, well, I mean, well, they're just saying this. And they didn't want to say that's a lie. I also remember an interview that Anderson Cooper had done with AOC, and where she had called Donald Trump, I believe, a racist. And he said, "Do you believe that in your heart?" And I was like, Anderson, what? She's not a cardiologist. She doesn't know his heart. She does know what his policies are, though. She knows what he says out of his mouth. And so I think that when we have journalists, even the ones that we kind of like or trust, their line of questioning, their line of thought, those are things that I kind of I do kind of a what when I hear, because that is there should be a lot more pushback. And a lot of journalists after Trump was out of office talked about their coverage of the 2016 election and how they failed in a lot of places. And yet here we are again, and it seems we have not learned anything. It's just the continuation. And that's where I think we start seeing the impact that money and capitalists, kind of have in our media, that it becomes about the dollar signs, it becomes about the ratings as opposed to the information. And that is a problem.
And Julia, what you said again, it is the reason that an analysis, even in looking at news, is so important, because who cares what is in his heart?
Right.
It is not the heart, it is the policies that people have to live under.
Yep.
And so as Anderson Cooper and his, I remember when he asked that, made me cringe.
Yeah, I was
right.
Like, what?
Because it also normalizes and frames for people that, oh yeah, what matters is the heart.
Mm-hmm. The heart of a person.
Not the policies, but what we should be looking at is what's in someone's heart.
Yep.
And that creates an expectation that endangers people who are historically marginalized in this society.
Yes.
It sends people with the type of privilege and power, and there are multiple types of privilege and power, as we all know that we can hold, but it sends people with privilege and power down this pathway of thinking, oh my gosh, we don't know what's in his heart, so how can we condemn? And then not really understanding when people who are historically marginalized and endangered by that line of thinking, why they're, saying, we don't care about the heart. We have to live under the policy. We need you to reframe. And then they think that they're being attacked or that this is unfair or whatever. Media has created this and normalized this.
Yes, and that actually gets to our next slide around like the illusion of objectivity, right? That, a lot of this is a lot of news now is we're going to present multiple facts, and not that we're going to tell you, but that you decide now. Like, so now you make the decision, and it's like that's actually not what is supposed to happen. And so I found this piece called "Why Objective Journalism is Misleading and a Dangerous Illusion" by and I cannot pronounce his last name, but his first name is Rob. He's a Dutch journalist. And he said, objective journalism, defined as not taking a position or having an opinion, has become precisely the opposite of what it was originally intended to be. Today, it equates to unquestionably repeating the opinions of the powerful by leaving the position taking to the public. We reduce our task as journalists to issuing press releases on behalf of elites. In short, we fail to fulfill our most basic duty. You are supposed to be informing people. And it's not enough, and he actually used the example of Trump. Like, if you have a president that is saying, hey, I had the largest, inauguration ever in history, and you see the pictures or you were there and that's not true, and you don't present it as, hey, the president of the United States has lied. And anytime the media has said that he has lied, you attack them. Their administration is attacking us. You better start questioning why. Not only is he lying, but why is the administration attacking the media when we're doing it? What is the purpose of this? What could this actually be? And so this kind of objective view, that's just not reality. The news takes a position every single day. When there's a war in some other country, they take a position on who they are behind in that war. That is a position. So that means when they go to that country, granted, I know America, not very big fans of Russia. They're not interviewing Russians, on the news daily about what's going on between, Russia and Ukraine. Like, if they're not showing, they don't even show, so there's always a position, right? So I think that this idea that they're trying to be objective is not okay. When you see who's asking the questions, a lot of our news folks are predominantly white. I remember when Obama was in office, MSNBC had a score of Black journalists and pundits who had shows. But when he was out, all of a sudden, all those folks went away. It was like a fad. right? Like, oh, well, the Black guy is gone, so now we don't need to have all these folks of color, asking all these questions. That race no longer plays a part in our discussions. And that is something I think I'm just like, well, that's not the way it should work. Move to the next slide. And so I think it's important for us to recognize this. And so we were just talking about Biden, the story about like his age and like should he be running? And a lot of does he have Parkinson's? That started from like a New York Times article about a doctor that was visiting the White House, even though they can't say who that doctor met with because that's not like public information and no one actually went and got that information. They just said, oh yeah, this guy was visiting the White House a bunch of times. And now it's like, oh, he has Parkinson's and he's hiding it. Even though Biden, I did see a lot of folks on the left kind of saying like, oh, well, he did pass like a major Parkinson's, like, like some laws, not the law, but like, he passed some stuff with that. Wouldn't that make more sense to assume that he has Parkinson's? But that is not what happened. So one news outlet came up with it, and now it's a discussion all week. And that is a problem. Project 2025, that came out in November of last year. Why was that not being discussed? That should have been the discussion since it came out, right? It's like, and so what we decide to talk about or what's discussed is a huge part of like how the information is shared. Carolyn.
I just wanted to say that 2 nights ago, for almost 1,000 people, I did a presentation on Project 2025. For the first time ever, I'm going to release the video and the slides as well as the resource list. So if anybody here is interested in receiving that, you can send me a private message with your email address and I will make sure you get it.
Right. Thank you for sharing that. That's important. Yes, information is power. So please make sure if you are interested, reach out to Carolyn for that. Thank you for doing that and providing that as a resource. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Carolyn, I
Yeah.
have been trying to read through some of that report, the 900 pages. So I very much appreciate your offering this.
Oh, well, it's not just Project 2025. It's Agenda 47, America First Agenda,
That too,
and the RNC. Yeah.
All of it. Yes.
And I'm going to go to our next slide. And I think it's also important when we're thinking about news as information, like trusting the information that we're receiving. Earlier this year, NBC had hired and then fired very quickly after some backlash, but Ronna McDaniel, who was the former RNC chair, and people were like, oh, it's because she's Republican. I was like, well, she pretty much said that the 2020 election was stolen. And she was helping with that. That's why people were like, she should, and she attacked the media up until that point, and then she was getting a job with the media. So the NBC News, all these are the decisions that they are making, right? And then we saw after the 2020 racial kind of like backlash and discussion around George Floyd's murder, everyone was like, we're dedicated to diversity and inclusion, we're dedicated to race and equity and equality. And then, earlier this week, CNN quietly eliminated their race and equality team as a part of layoffs. So like, what gets cut first? When the money starts to come into the scene, what stories don't get told. And so that's why, as we're kind of wrapping up today, we want to push for us to like read and engage with more local news. Next slide. So we think that it's very important when we're talking about expanded views in local news. So including like diverse coverage provides like, nuance and balanced portrayal of information. It can foster perspectives and enhance storytelling. It addresses stories that aren't always told with new perspectives. And it can actually increase audience trust and cultivate engaged public. And it promotes inclusivity and representation. A lot of folks of color, I know as a Black person, like the news is like, you're kind of chew some of the meat and spit out the bones, and you usually go in search of other information. But by having more expanded views in our media, who have like, more background, I think about someone like Nicole Hannah Brown, who did the 1619 Project. So her information and her work in journalism is powerful because it adds a whole other dimension to not just the news that we're receiving now, but the news that we have received in the past, the history of why things are the way they are. And local news is certainly something that is unfortunately dying. When we talk about things like like the city paper that used to be in Baltimore, which was free, is no longer available, or the buying of the Baltimore Sun, and that local news is one of our most trusted sources for information around the world, about the world around us, and it can help us understand what's happening in our daily lives and what shapes our daily lives, and it connects us to our community and to our neighbors, and hopefully it is uplifting voices that usually go unheard. And it lends us agency and empowers us with the knowledge we need to make informed decisions. So about whether it be like our mayors, whether it be about our governors, making sure that you are supporting news that has expanded views and that is local is, I think, one of the first things you can do to better, think about the news and media and the information that you're consuming. Next slide. So I provided like two examples earlier this week. I saw this on Twitter. There was a Chicago Heights, this is in, Chicago, a homeowner whose property tax bill had went up from $1,800 a year to $30,000. And when he called, the Cook County tax assessor, they were like, well, everyone's taxes are going up. And so then he called his local news station and told them what was going on, and they did a story. And when they called the tax office, they said, oh, they discovered, oh, that was an error. That was actually done by mistake. Now, here was this person who was possibly about to have to lose their house, about to have to lose their land, right? And had he not called the local news, like, hey, this is happening, they're saying it's happening to everybody. It was like, that's a problem. Or the Baltimore Beat, who is doing amazing work. They shared a story about a Black woman who was talking about an Amtrak project, which is a federal, that's a part of a federal funded project that threatens their neighborhood and their children, right? It's like, and so this is about, this is climate, kind of news. This is this is news that is impacting folks of color, and we know that they are disproportionately and always usually impacted by, well, first about what happens. So following local news is not just about getting information, but it's also about when something happens, you have a voice, so you can contact, you can share. And so local news is actually very important, and hopefully getting more expanded views. Next slide, as we start to wrap up. So how can we do better, diversifying our sources of where we get our information, so supporting local independent news, practicing media balance, if you're going to watch CNN, watch that, but also like making sure that you are balancing that information with other points of view, and practicing media literacy. Media literacy, that can be a whole other event. But that is something that I have been seeing. I think it's going to be continue to be a problem in this election cycle. So making sure that you are checking your sources, checking where people are getting information before you're sharing stuff. Where did this come from? Who wrote this? What other views are there? And also like talk with other people about the information that you're reading. Have uncomfortable conversations. Allow yourself to be pushed. I think that is where we can all do a little bit better. Next slide. And so one of the things I wanted to open up is like, what local or independent news are you engaged with? We have a list, I think, here that we'll share in a bit, but like a few of them. But I want folks to be able to share, where are they getting their information? Who are some folks that they enjoy reading, or who, you enjoy their work, whether it be on TV, radio. You can do the next slide, because I think that sharing is caring, and I'm always looking for new places to read stuff. So I know in Baltimore, I have what's like the Baltimore Banner. Obviously, I mentioned the Baltimore Beat, the Baltimore Afro-American newspaper, which is the oldest Black newspaper in the country, the Baltimore Times, and of course, when I think about radio, WEEA, which means we educate African Americans, as my dad always tells me, like I forgot, 88.9. And also, I believe someone had mentioned Democracy Now!, which is something that I also listen to and watch intently. So if there are any people or news sites or places that you get information, please share in the chat or share out loud, just so other folks can maybe take a listen to find out what's happening in other places. And I also think it's important to read news from other, like, states and cities, because a lot of the time we are aligned. What's happening in Chicago can already happen if it's not already happening here. And so it can also, I think, give folks the ability to collaborate, to work across the lines to make change. And next slide. So final thoughts. The media can inform and it can entertain, but it can also be used as a tool to indoctrinate. It can be abused, and it's important to remember that as you are receiving information. And while the role of the news is to inform the public, it's important to remember that it's continuing to be shaped by the status quo. It's uplifting and keeping that status quo in front of you at all times. As the news media continues to shift, it is up to us to interrogate what is being said and what isn't being said. That is a really big piece I want folks to walk away with. And using your ARAO lens can help us make ask better questions and search. That's incomplete. And search for other answers. I think that is very important. That you're constantly growing and changing. This is not like you do it once and you're set, but this is actually a practice. And reading more, interrogating more, having more conversations is beneficial, I think, for all of us, especially I think in this current year with this election, we're going to definitely need it. So next slide. I want to thank you all for coming to this 13th of the month. These are always very fun and exciting to talk about, like, just various topics. And so I hope you join us for our next one, which is actually going to be in person. It's called Black August, Uplifting the History of Resistance Behind the Walls. It's going to be at one of my favorite places, the Indoctrinated Central Library. And it's going to be on Tuesday, August 13th from 6 to 7:30. So if you want to come and learn more about Black August, we invite you to do so. And for our next slide. And we also have our pre-registration is now open for fall workshops for white people. So you can use this QR code to sign up, and we hope to see you all there for these. These are the dates. And if you would like to support our work, we definitely welcome it. So you can use a QR code here. This work is necessary work. It is a work that gets a lot, but it is necessary and I think timely. And so we would welcome and invite you to support our mutual work by becoming a monthly sustainer or a one-time donor. And you can use this QR code to do so. So I want to thank you all for coming and spending some time with us this Saturday morning. And we hope to see you in August. And don't forget to also check out our YouTube for past events. Thanks.